Metal gives off its own thin scream when it burns. Not the crackle of flame, but the hoarse groan of armor plate twisting and warping under internal stress as heat works it. January 26, 1945. Alsace, France, near Holtzwihr. A knocked-out M10 tank destroyer lay crippled on the edge of a field, flames climbing out of the engine compartment and crawling toward the rear. Black smoke hardened in the cold air into a vertical, ominous column. On top of that burning steel, a figure moved. Second Lieutenant Audie Murphy of the U.S. Army's 15th Infantry Regiment pressed himself into the open fighting compartment at the back of the vehicle. His movement had the near mathematical precision of someone doing sums under fire. Avoid the hottest metal, test each plate with a boot before trusting it, keep his weight centered, then reach for the grips of the .50 caliber Browning heavy machine gun. He chose the highest point that still gave him a stable stance, because a fall here meant more than injury. It meant the end of the one advantage he had just bought. The gun was scorching. He fired anyway. From a distance, it looked like a last desperate dance in the flames. But the reason for choosing this place was cold and exact. Height. Down on level ground, his view was shredded by hedgerows, smoke and low winter vegetation. Fog and powder haze turned the field into narrow windows that opened and closed without warning. Up here, on the crown of a burning wreck, he gained what might be the widest field of vision anywhere along that sector. He needed to see how the Germans were moving, and more than that, he needed an artillery observer somewhere behind him to be able to see through his eyes. The machine gun could suppress and delay, but the thing that could break the enemy's attack at the spine was the incoming artillery barrage he had to believe was coming soon. The burning M10 was not a shield. It was a lookout tower, a firing platform. At the edge of a line about to collapse, it was the first move he had calculated. To understand why, you have to rewind to dawn. Cold had weight. It pressed wetly into every foxhole outside Holtzwihr. It was the particular winter damp of eastern France, a chill that seeped into bone and made time feel slower. Fog hung like white gauze in bare treetops and across open fields. The ground was frozen hard. An entrenching tool could only scratch pale marks into it. Men huddled with shoulders rounded, trying to keep their hands warm without letting fingers go numb on the trigger. Breath whitened and mixed with mist. Silence was stretched tight as a wire, and everyone listened for what lay under it. The sound arrived gradually, like bad news soaking through cloth. First came a dull rumble on the horizon, impossible to tell whether it was tanks or trucks. It rose, faded, rose again, as if the ground itself were muttering. Then a sharp rising whistle tore the air apart. Mortar rounds. The first burst left front of the position, flinging frozen earth and grass roots into the grey-white sky. The second. The third. Their impacts walked forward in a steady pattern, stepping closer by disciplined increments. You could feel the calculation in it, a methodical tightening of the circle, each burst a few yards nearer, each pause just long enough for the next tube to be laid. Men counted the intervals without meaning to, judging when to duck and when to look up. When a round landed close, frozen clods struck like thrown stones, and the air filled with a brief, choking taste of earth. Heavier shells joined in, and the thunder of explosions began to stitch together until the ground itself shivered. In an instant, the battle slammed into full volume. Rifle cracks, bursts from automatic weapons, the MG-42's ripping, canvas-tearing roar, the hammer of detonations, shouts and clipped orders, all compressed and poured straight into the ear. The noise layered and overlapped until it was hard to separate one danger from another. Bullets snapped overhead, shards hissed through frozen grass. A man could shout a warning into another man's face and still not be heard. Murphy's platoon position was a short length of dike in a storm, absorbing waves that hit harder each time. German infantry shapes began to appear in gaps between fog and smoke. They moved in small groups, bounding forward in alternating rushes under precise cover from armoured fire. Their intent was obvious. Find the weak point, punch through, then roll up the flanks. The first exchange was a brutal firefight. But quickly a deeper danger emerged, one more corrosive than the enemy's forward momentum. The system itself was beginning to seize. The critical field telephone line went dead not long after the shelling started. The loss was immediate and concrete. Orders that had been routine now had to be shouted down a ditch or sent by a man crawling on his belly. Corrections came late. Reports came broken. Each squad began to fight its own small fight, guessing at the larger picture by sound alone. The communications man ran out again and again, crawling between craters to splice the break. Each time he got close to success, another blast or sweep of fire snapped the line again. When it did connect, briefly, the headset carried anxious but garbled questions, the words drowned in static and the distant concussion of other positions being hit. You held your own hole and fired at every shadow that moved, but you began not to know whether the left flank still existed, whether the machine gun on the right had already gone silent. You became a single isolated point while the overall shape of the line blurred and warped. The sense of the battlefield as something you could perceive and control bled away with every failed attempt to communicate. Casualties stopped being numbers on a report. They were the familiar crack of a nearby rifle going quiet, a muffled groan forced down, the look in an ammo-bearer's eyes when he handed over the last magazine, unable to hide his fear. Pressure was invisible, but it filled every lungful of powder-tainted cold air. The line was being squeezed inward by an organized, overwhelming force, bent and deformed until it threatened to fracture from a line into a scatter of helpless points. Murphy stood right on that threshold. Hold here, no matter what. That meant his platoon would likely be swallowed whole in the next moment. Retreat. Breaking contact under heavy fire was the most dangerous chapter in any manual. His decision formed in the brief gaps between detonations. The order went out by shouted words, by hand signals, by the knowing glance of squad leaders he could still reach. The core was simple. Fall back, alternating cover, contracting toward the brush-covered ridge on the rear flank of the company's main position. It was movement by halves. One element fired, then peeled back. The next rose and moved while the first covered. Men crawled when they could, ran when they had to, and dropped again at the next fold of ground. Murphy enforced the rhythm with simple signals: a raised fist to hold, 2 fingers to shift, a sweeping arm to peel back. He made them leave only when another weapon was already firing, and he made them stop long enough to reface forward so the retreat did not turn into flight. It was slow, ugly work, but it preserved shape. This was not a rout. It was a contraction with pain in it, like a fist drawing back until the knuckles went white. In the deafening noise, it might have sounded like an admission of defeat, but on a larger tactical scale, it was a deliberate reshaping. He abandoned a forward edge about to be washed away, choosing to preserve fighting strength. At the same time, he left behind a strip of killing ground. That space would bleed the German assault of its sharpness. More importantly, it cleared a stage for what he meant to do next. It set the distance. He ordered the platoon back not only to save them, but to free himself from the obligation to hold a whole line that was already breaking and to take on a harsher, narrower task. To become a nail, an observation post, a lever point that might make a counterstroke possible. Retreat was not the end of the story. It was the condition that made the next move executable. Under his direction, the platoon began to move, hard and orderly. Men passed the word down the line with touches on shoulders and quick gestures. A squad drifted rearward along a shallow ditch, while another stayed planted and fired controlled bursts to keep heads down. Someone dragged a wounded man by the straps of his web gear, stopping twice to catch breath. Every few yards, Murphy signaled a pause and a realignment so the fall back did not turn into a scatter. Each man, just before leaving cover, instinctively looked toward the burning solitary place where he remained. In that glance were confusion, worry, and perhaps the blurred, desperate hope you find in a cornered moment. Then they vanished into smoke and folds of ground. An uncanny hollowness spread across the position. Gunfire thinned, leaving only the distant grind of artillery and the nearer crackle of flame. Now there was truly only one man left, facing the grey wave gathering itself for the final crush. Murphy drew a breath that burned and choked. He pressed himself tighter against the scorching gun. The real calculation was only beginning. Flame licked the armor, and heat shimmered in the air, bending sight. Through wavering smoke and drifting blackness, Murphy locked his eyes forward. He scanned instead of staring, reading the field for movement and for the small cues that meant men were about to rush. The sudden stillness that precedes a sprint, the way a group leans forward when it is about to go, the telltale shift of fog as bodies push through it. When his view narrowed, he adjusted his stance rather than his story, leaning a few inches, changing angle, recovering the same reference point so his judgment stayed consistent. Beyond a rise, along the edge of a tree line, grey-green shapes began to stir and mass again. The Germans did not relax at the sudden emptiness of the American position. They judged it a retreat, an opening to widen the breakthrough. The gears of the assault sped up. Murphy squeezed the trigger. The Browning answered with a deep, steady roar. Short bursts punched through the brief quiet. Tracer rounds cut red lines into the fog and shadow. This fire was less about piling up bodies than about making a statement, taking a measure, buying seconds. He watched what his bursts did, then adjusted his aim by feet rather than yards, shaping a beaten zone that forced the enemy to hesitate or go to ground. He wrote an invisible boundary in bullets. "Stop here." His lips were cracked. He kept them close to a telephone handset that had, by some miracle, regained a sliver of signal. Static shrieked. Explosions arrived through the wire as dull tremors. He pressed the receiver tight and spoke with discipline, keeping every call short enough to survive the noise. At this moment he split into two people, a rifleman on a burning platform fighting to stay alive and a forward observer who had to remain absolutely calm. "Target in my front about 200 yards, tree line edge, infantry group. Request smoke, 1 round to adjust. Over." He forced his voice steady, even as heat and cold pulled his senses apart. His eyes snapped between the moving shapes, the haze, and a reference point he chose on the spot. A tree that had been blasted crooked. He used that tree as an anchor, returning to it whenever smoke erased depth and the field turned featureless. The seconds waiting for an answer lasted like a century. Occasionally a bullet rang against the M10's thick frontal armor with a sharp metallic slap, a sound that hammered his nerves and reminded him how visible he was. The first adjusting round fell long, exploding behind the German mass and throwing up a burst of dirt. He shouted the correction immediately, keeping the language stripped down. Short, clear, repeatable. He repeated the essential part twice, not as emphasis, but as insurance against a line that might drop mid-syllable. If the receiver spat only half a sentence back at him, he filled in the missing part from memory and stayed with the same frame of reference. The point was not elegance. It was continuity. His brain ran at full speed, converting what he saw into the coordinate language the guns could use. At the same time, his finger moved by muscle memory, raking a burst across shadows, trying to slide along the flank during a lull. It was one man fighting on two lines at once, the hot, immediate line of bullets and the cold, calculated line of ballistic correction. The second adjusting round came closer, still right of the mark. He corrected again. Faster now, urgency tightening his words while he fought to keep each one clean. He could picture it, or he had to believe it, an artillery position behind him turning tables and dials, reading firing charts, taking his call from the flames and translating it into steel. The fire had crawled closer to the fighting compartment. Smoke stung his eyes until tears ran and the world blurred. He wiped his face. Skin scraped raw under soot. But he could not climb down. Climbing down meant giving up the view purchased with danger, giving up the intermittent line that could decide everything. Then the nature of the sound changed. No longer single rounds popping in tentative tests. The sky carried a heavy collective whoosh from far to near, like countless enormous scythes cutting through air at once. A mass of shells, perhaps a full battery firing together, began to fall. The impacts were no longer scattered. They clustered and walked with purpose over the area Murphy had been naming again and again, the tree-line edge where German infantry had gathered. Flash after flash joined into a white-hot carpet. The roar swallowed every other noise. Shockwaves, loaded with dirt, splinters, and death, swept across the field. Even from his exposed perch, he felt the burning wreck under his feet tremble with each hit. He ceased firing and used that instant to watch. Smoke thickened into a rolling black wall, but he could see what mattered. The German rhythm broke. The organized forward surge faltered. Gaps opened in the attack line. The pressure that had been driving inexorably forward became sticky, then hesitant, then, for the first time, pulled back. The barrage extended, reaching farther to suppress what must have been supporting positions. The density and accuracy showed the guns had the area in their teeth. A turning point had arrived. The artillery created not only casualties, but time, a psychological blow, a wall of fire the enemy had to reassess before crossing. Murphy shouted again into the handset, voice rough, asking the fire to shift toward the flanks where he judged weakness still remained. Almost as soon as the barrage took hold, the pressure across the battlefield redistributed. Isolated American points of resistance that had felt seconds from being overrun suddenly felt the weight lift from their front. Other officers and non-commissioned leaders in B Company, even with broken communications, sensed the opening. Calls rose through the smoke, this time edged with urgency and hope. Up! Forward! Take it back! Against the continuing rumble of artillery, Murphy saw movement on both sides farther down the line. American soldiers climbed out of craters and behind cover, pushing forward cautiously, but with resolve to reclaim lost ground. They were not many, and their movement was not swift, but the will to counterattack, long pressed down, had been relit by accurate fire. You could see it in the way heads came up and stayed up, in the way men began to look left and right again, checking alignment instead of only survival. A few shouted short directions that others obeyed without argument. The scattered points started to reconnect not by radio or wire, but by simple mutual visibility and the regained belief that the front could be held. The German assault machine, so smooth a moment before, had jammed. Murphy, a nail driven into a hinge, and the artillery, a hammer blow, had locked it in place. After a long, suffocating tilt, the balance of the fight shuddered and began to swing back. The fury of the barrage drifted away toward the rear, reaching for deeper targets. The forward field near Holtzwihr fell into a strange quiet by comparison. A few scattered shots sounded distant and hollow. The crackle of the burning M10 and the low moan of stressed metal now came through with painful clarity. Wind thinned the smoke. The wreckage of the fight revealed itself by degrees. Murphy loosened his grip on the machine gun. His fingers were so stiff he could barely straighten them. He climbed down from the hot steel. His steps were unsteady. Heat, strain, and exhaustion had turned his legs soft. Cold air flooded his lungs, cutting the taste of smoke and char and bringing a wave of dizziness. He turned and started toward the direction his platoon had withdrawn, walking unevenly across frozen ground. He had not gone far when he met his men. They were creeping forward again, searching and covering, their faces a mix of fatigue, caution, and the stunned blankness of survival. "Lieutenant!" a sergeant blurted when he saw him, eyes widening. They had been sure he was dead on that burning torch of metal. Murphy only nodded. His throat was too dry to make sound. They gathered with other survivors and reformed what remained. A quick count followed, rough and grim. Losses were heavy, but the unit still existed. The core fighting strength had been preserved. More than that, they had steadied themselves. Portions of the forward ground had been retaken. Along the broader line, the German offensive seemed to stall, as if this reversal had forced a pause everywhere. Company communications finally stabilized. When the report went up, the company commander's voice carried a trace of relief. They were ordered off the line to rest, replaced by reserves. Only then did the nerves stretched tight for hours loosen slightly, and the exhaustion and battle numbness roll in like cold surf. Murphy looked back one last time. The M10 still burned, the flames lower now, black smoke rising straight into the grey sky like a cooling, silent monument. That heap of scrap metal, for the decisive span of minutes, had become the fulcrum that moved the fight. He had climbed onto it not to die for a story, but to get the view, to turn himself into the single conduit between the front line's desperation and the rear's firepower. He had ordered the retreat not as a bid for personal survival, but to make the one kind of stand that might actually hold. Weeks later, when the after-action reports were written and the accounts of heroism pushed up through channels, Murphy's action on the burning tank destroyer was distilled and compressed into a citation that matched every requirement of military prose. It recorded precisely: time, January 26, 1945. Place, near Holtzwihr, France. Person, Second Lieutenant Audie L. Murphy. Act, that when his company was attacked by a superior enemy force, suffering heavy casualties and facing a critical threat to the line, he directed an orderly withdrawal, remained at the most forward position, mounted a burning tank destroyer and, exposed to extreme danger, used its machine gun to suppress enemy infantry and effectively directed friendly artillery fire. It concluded that his action was decisive in breaking the attack and stabilizing the situation. History, in its calmest words, gathered up all the damp cold, the heat, the metallic screaming, the anxiety, the incoming whoosh, the fear, and the decision of that morning, and made it into a file that could be circulated and honored. Yet beneath that label, what happened at Holtzwihr looked less like a simple tale of courage than a case study in managing a reversal at the brink of collapse. When the line was about to be crushed, when the command system was partly failing, Murphy did not try to patch every hole. That was no longer possible. He chose a deeper strategy: identify the single point that, if held, could activate what remained of the entire system. He chose to become that point. The retreat bought time for the larger shape to contract and reform. Climbing onto the burning wreck maximized his value as an observation and fire node. Calling the artillery turned one man's view into a system's destructive output. So it was not only a story about nerve, it was a story about how control can be rebuilt under absolute disadvantage. It argued that when you cannot hold everything, you must judge with cold clarity what single thing you can hold that will make the rest possible to hold again. For Audie Murphy, on that cold morning of January 26, 1945, between smoke and flame near Holtzwihr, what had to be held was height, sight, a telephone line that came and went, and his own body as the irreplaceable node connecting the front's despair to the rear's power. He held it. And because he held it, the line held. Burning steel did not become his grave. It became the hard fulcrum by which he understood and moved a chaotic fight. History remembers the courage. Tactical wisdom may lie in remembering the rest. Sometimes the truest courage is to see every fear and every disadvantage clearly, and still be able to find and walk onto the single rough, forward, executable path.